Ladies and gentlemen, it's what you've been waiting for. Angel Attack! Ready? Fire!
If ever there was a video that I became increasingly terrified to release as I continued to play the game, if ever there was any game that I combed and combed, trying desperately to prove my own thoughts wrong and flip my perspective, if ever there was a script where part of me just wished I could lie and say everything was great, it would be this one. I don't want to be the guy that loathed most of his experience with Bayonetta, because I know what response it's likely to get. Hack and slash fans can on occasion be very, very protective of the games they love, to the point that some can become extremely hostile when you try to level criticism at said games. Obviously, that's not everyone. I myself am a fan of the genre that was there from the very beginning, championing Devil May Cry when everyone else was talking up Halo 1 and GTA 3. I played and replayed DMC 1 and 3. I always thought it was funny that they skipped making Devil May Cry 2 because 3 was just so big of an improvement over the first. I read and reread the magazine articles about games like DMC 4, and it was one of the first games I picked up for my 360. But to a select few people, the second you argue a critical darling within the genre has a problem, none of that matters. Suddenly you just don't get it, and are marked as the villain who has some hidden agenda against their favorite game. With that being said, I'm also not gonna pretend that I think Bayonetta is a good game. I don't think it's a good game. I think in many ways it's a shockingly weak game, though that does not preclude it from having good elements, which we will of course discuss. Also, fair warning that I myself am not particularly good at this game, and was terrible when I first started playing it. I'm competent enough at action games like this, but I'm not good at this game specifically. I was able to beat it on normal, hard, and infinite climax, as well as get the platinum trophy, without using glitches or exploits or anything. But I also didn't do it in the ways that the hardcore fans would likely consider legit, by learning all of the intricacies of the combat and shooting for high ranks. I used what felt like the most efficient options for me, and I wasn't afraid to use items either. After all of my playthroughs, I don't think I could get platinum awards on most chapters on any difficulty other than normal, and it would take me some legitimate effort to do it on normal at that. However, I don't think that discounts my critique, because this was still ultimately my experience with the game itself. Not to mention, the normal experience had by the majority is not the same as the top tier players, and as such your average experience is at least as valid to the design of the game as that of the players who learn every minute intricacy and play it for years. The game is primarily designed with the expectation that most players won't dig that deep, and so the average experience is important. I've played some Bayonetta before doing so for this critique, and my prevailing main issue, similar to Devil May Cry, has always been that it doesn't do a good job on normal teaching the player the necessary mechanics to get the most out of the game, nor does it really prepare you particularly well for the harder difficulties. That was what I expected to be the focus of this video going into it. I legitimately assumed it would effectively boil down to, Bayonetta is a solid game, but its mechanical design is purely intrinsically linked to how much a player cares about arbitrary ranks at the end of each mission. If you don't care about that, the game devolves into a bland button masher. I thought the video was going to center around the psychology of player incentives, and how the game could better push players in the right direction without forcing them down a restricted path. And we will definitely discuss that, because it's something I feel is a problem, but it's not what ruined my playthroughs here and made them, for the most part, decidedly unenjoyable and frustrating. But first, I think we should start with the core of Bayonetta, the thing that most people who love the game will cite as its strongest pillar. The part of the game that is decidedly pretty great, no qualifiers needed. The combat mechanics in Bayonetta are unique, engaging, and deep, with a high skill ceiling for mastery. And for many people, understandably, that's all that matters. At the outset, if you've ever played a Devil May Cry, you'll likely find yourself with one of two misconceptions when you first start up Bayonetta. Either you'll think it's far deeper than any DMC due to the initially overwhelming amount of combos and options it presents to players, or you're wizened enough to prematurely jump to the conclusion that this is all just padding to make shallow systems appear deep. Bayonetta's mechanics look like the stereotype we all have for fighting games before we actually play them. Large lists of long combos that you just mash out to look flashy. And to some extent, that can kind of be true for reasons we'll explore later. You can indeed just mash and still look flashy while playing Bayonetta. And while there are technically small differences between a lot of the combo options that otherwise serve the same fundamental purpose, there is also a lot of overlap that makes memorizing even a fifth of a single weapon's moveset pointless for the majority of players. Despite this, though, both of these misconceptions are mostly wrong. Bayonetta is less about spamming combos than either of these conclusions would imply. Instead, it's much more about maintaining these combos in conjunction with defensive maneuvers. What combo you use can matter, but it matters for different reasons than you'd initially expect. And ultimately, the primary goal is to avoid dropping your combo. That's the core skill that all of Bayonetta's mechanics are designed to test, beyond the flashiness that's required to get to a high rank. There's one major fundamental difference between the way Devil May Cry handles its combo system and the way Bayonetta does. In Devil May Cry, most of your attacks are accessible at any time. It works like Street Fighter in that you can more or less always access your special moves with a specific button combination. The series doesn't even really have combos to list in that sense. Just a list of moves to freely link together in whatever order you please. If you want to spam Stinger forever, you can spam Stinger forever. Each of these special moves, with each weapon, is designed to fulfill a specific role in combat, like knocking the enemy into the air, hitting multiple enemies at once with an area of effect, or stunning an enemy, etc. The ranking system pushes the player to use a wide variety of these moves, with a wide variety of weapons, but in terms of combat effectiveness, your goal is to use the same wide variety of moves, based on what the best action is at the moment. You pull an enemy away from a crowd to isolate them, or use Stinger to push them away and give yourself space. When firing on all cylinders, generally the practical goals and ranking goals overlap well in DMC. In Bayonetta, you also have access to many of the same types of special moves, like the ability to grapple an enemy toward you with a whip, or an uppercut that launches enemies, and these can mostly be used at any time. But rather than being the core of the experience, these orthogonal abilities are tangential to the real focus. The ranking system doesn't care much about your use of these options. As such, your use of these special moves is much more wholly utilitarian in Bayonetta. Most of the time, you use them purely because they are the logical option in that moment. Unlike DMC, Bayonetta has dozens of combos it openly lays out to you. Some are short, some are long, some end in finishers, some don't. Bayonetta's core conceit with combos is that you generally want to find your way to one of your Wicked Weave finishers, which do more damage the longer the combo is and can leave the enemy in different states, like launched into the air, laying on the ground, or in a crumpled heap across the arena if you need space. These finishers basically always stagger most enemies and do large chunks of damage at once. Once that's understood, you might naturally assume that you simply spam the longest combo for the highest damage, and that's all the depth gone out of the window. And this, again, is both kind of accurate and wildly inaccurate as a conclusion, because the combos aren't the only part of the story. Bayonetta's other major mechanic is... what? No, it's not Witch Time. Witch Time is afforded to players when they dodge just before getting hit by certain attacks. It then slows down time for a few seconds, allowing you to dish out tons of free damage. However, this isn't even available under normal circumstances on the hardest difficulty, Infinite Climax. No, the other major mechanic central to Bayonetta's combat is the dodge itself. Bayonetta has a dedicated dodge button that will cancel basically any action as soon as you press it. It is your most powerful and most valuable piece of kit. Several of the other major pillars of Bayonetta's combat revolve around the dodge. The two biggest are the aforementioned Witch Time and Dodge Offset. In a vacuum, the theory is that you won't always be able to get your combos off without being interrupted, whether because the enemy blocks and tries to retaliate, they tank your hits without flinching, or another enemy decides they don't want to wait their turn, whatever. Stopping here with simple combos and a dodge would likely lead to combos being very unsatisfying, because you'd either be forced to spam tiny combos for minimal damage, go for longer combos and pray that they land properly, or sit on the other side of the arena comboing the air until you get a Wicked Weave finisher, which will teleport to the enemy's location. You would therefore deduce that the linear combos were a terrible idea and that the system would work much better if they had just copied DMC. In comes dodge offset. If instead of simply pressing an attack button and then dodging to safety, you hold the attack button down as you dodge, you activate dodge offset. Dodge offset keeps your place in a combo, allowing it to continue after your dodge. And there's no real limit to how many times you can use dodge offset in a combo either. You can effectively utilize dodge offset in between every single attack if necessary. It's even possible to intentionally and instantly cancel attacks with dodges to get to the finishing moves much quicker, if the rest of the combo itself is unnecessary in your situation for some reason. In practice, dodge offset feels somewhat similar to storing Juri's Fuhajin fireball kicks in Street Fighter IV. After you perform the button combination for a Fuhajin, if you hold the attack button down, you can store the projectile until you let the button go. Juri has 3 different Fuhajin projectiles depending on whether you use the light, medium, or heavy kick button, all of which can be held at once, making you very dangerous to approaching opponents. It doesn't matter if they're in the air or on the ground. As long as you have all of them charged up, you have 3 instant long-range options. Meanwhile, using the dodge offset combo cancels to get to Wicked Weaves quicker resembles something akin to using Magnet to go straight into combo finishers in Kingdom Hearts 2. Suddenly, you realize that dodge offset is the most powerful part of the system, and is the glue that brings it all together. Without it, your ability to finish combos is almost entirely up to the enemies you're facing. But with it, you're in control. You're not only thinking about which combos will be the most effective in terms of the handful of finishers they provide, but there's also the question of how long of a combo you're willing to risk when put up against your proficiency at using dodge offset. The majority of normal enemies are designed to reinforce these systems, with some that are immune to witch time, or ones that attack really swiftly and with combos of their own. Others shoot projectiles or can temporarily stun you out of your combos. Some fly around, necessitating some sort of focus on ranged damage dealing, etc. Another type can only be hit with ranged attacks, angel weapons, Wicked Weaves, or while you're in witch time, with normal combo attacks instead stunning and damaging Bayonetta herself. Now, some of the ways the game becomes more challenging on harder difficulties will likely hamstring players into very specific strategies unless you're the best of the best. One example would be the lack of witch time on Infinite Climax, or when fighting the glorious and gracious enemy types in general. I'm sure there are ways to deal with these challenges without the Moon of Mahakala accessory, that still maintain a high combo rating. The Moon accessory allows you to block or even counter attacks by pushing toward the enemy right before their attack hits, staggering them and potentially doing a fair chunk of damage. And at least on normal and hard, this also forces them into witch time, even though that's usually not allowed against Gracious and Glorious. But when there are 2 or more of them, or a wealth of other enemies on Infinite Climax bearing down on you, there are times where it seems like you're kind of restricted in your options. Again, unless you've absolutely 100% mastered the game. But this is a relatively small issue. Speaking of harder difficulties though, hard makes the enemies significantly more aggressive, fast, they use new moves and use more dangerous moves more often, mob configurations are more dangerous and diverse, and enemies have more health and do more damage. Infinite Climax meanwhile straight up removes witch time outside of very, very specific, player-driven circumstances, meaning you're no longer able to get free combos by memorizing dodge timings. You have to learn dodge offset, or use an alternative tactic that will likely result in a lower ranking. When taken as a whole, these systems are indeed deep, engaging, and rewarding to use in conjunction with each other. I'm not going to argue otherwise because it would be untrue. This is the thing that has made Platinum such a respected developer, and why fans of their games can sometimes be so rabid. I don't want to take that away from the people who like these games, because I understand why people are attracted to the mechanics at a high level. Said mechanics are different from DMC, but they're not some hollow facsimile aimed at looking deeper than they are. They provide a high level of mastery that fans of the genre really revel in. The problems start to crop up once you take the mechanics out of the vacuum and start looking at their impact on the actual game's design. Or more specifically, when you realize that Normal does a terrible job of teaching the player nearly all of this, actively pushing them toward bad habits, and is the only difficulty available on the new file outside of easy and very easy, which both push you to use automatic mode, which combos for you. Quick note, some of my example footage might look a bit worse than other parts, and will run at 30 frames per second instead of 60. This is because I mostly only captured my whole normal playthrough due to lack of space for footage, and then used my PS4 Pro's internal capture for some examples that happened during the rest of my playtime. On my normal playthrough, I basically just spammed whatever I wanted, without thinking about it. I was mashing and doing fine. I relied extremely heavily on witch time and chose whatever weapon was the most effective to spam in terms of raw damage output. I saw dodge offset in the menu, but the description gave me absolutely no indication of why it would be useful for me to learn, since ignoring it was working just fine. Mashing was more efficient by far than fiddling with dodge offset. After a while, I got the muscle memory for a few specific combos, and used those combos almost exclusively without issue. The game didn't push back against this at all, and kind of rewarded it. The point being, thanks to many design issues along the way related to things like weapon pacing, tutorialization, and mechanical balance, I picked several choices that really set me back and forced me to unlearn a lot of muscle memory I'd picked up once I got to hard and infinite climax. The game incentivized that I dug my own grave, and then laughed at me once I got past normal and it all came crashing down. While the onus is to some extent on players to learn mechanics and ideas from the game, it's also generally not good practice to throw distractions and things at the player that will actively steer them away from your intentions. An easy scapegoat for this would be witch time. Witch time is so powerful that dodge offset is completely unnecessary on normal. There's not too much else to it. If you can get free combos on enemies by just timing your dodges, and if that earns you magic that can then lead to free kills through torture attacks, why would anybody actively try to learn something as unorthodox and sometimes difficult as dodge offset? This can even apply to hard if you focus solely on dodging well or equip specific accessories. The weapon pacing doesn't really help matters either. Bayonetta throws most of its core weapon styles at you in the first half of the game. Several of them are found in just a few chapters alone, and while that's not inherently a bad idea, it becomes an issue when these weapons further pull people away from the core of the game's systems. Even if you somehow decide to be proactive enough on normal to try and learn dodge offset, it's significantly harder to learn and use when your weapon of choice is Kolshedra the Whip, Sharaba the Katana, or Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore the dual rocket launchers. Holding the attack button with Kolshedra pulls enemies toward you instead of doing a sustained attack like your basic pistols, the Scarborough Fair. And the Sharaba enters a charging state for an area of effect slash. Not only does this slash do tons of damage, to the point that learning it can absolutely decimate normal's difficulty on its own, but while you can dodge offset from it, doing normal dodge offset attacks means any time between slashes is empty space where you're not doing damage. Compare that with your basic weapons, which will keep firing to deal chip damage. And if you end up charging the slash attack, then that has to be your next attack out of dodge offset before you go back into your normal combo. It's a lot more of a complicated weapon to push the mechanics with, and a lot easier of a weapon to just spam with, sending the entire wrong message. Point being, I honestly think the game should have at least gone through the first boss before you get anything but the basic handguns and shotguns. Push players to use dodge offset, and give them the weapons that are most conducive to learning it. A similar issue can be had with the accessories and special moves in the shop. On the one hand, I like that you can buy basically anything right from the get-go, if you're willing to save for it. This gives first-time players a lot of variety for builds on their first playthroughs. On the other hand, many of these abilities or accessories have very specific effects that are likely to push players further away from the core mechanics, and into the hands of really specific habits that won't work later. Meanwhile, the tutorial basically does nothing but teach players the most basic controls, literally what a combo is and how to read the interface for the combo list, and not much else of real value to Bayonetta in particular. It's very, very high level in the sense that most of its tutorialization is general advice that works for 90% of action games. Enemy pacing on normal is fine in relation to this part of the discussion, since it starts with the easier, more clearly telegraphed enemies, and enemies are so slow and timid on normal that players are given a lot of room to experiment if they choose to. But it does nothing to focus them, and as we'll get to a bit later, there are other issues present with the enemy mobs on normal that affect the game negatively in other ways. All these issues with normal infinitely compound on themselves when you realize that normal is the only standard difficulty available from the start. Again, you have to play through it to unlock hard, and the same with hard to unlock infinite climax. Particularly with how antithetical Witch Time is to learning the desired mechanics, I struggled to understand this decision. Normal is a different game entirely, but because it's forced on you instead of just being a different, goofy alternative mode that recontextualizes gameplay, it's the standard you come to rely on before it's ripped away from you. To be fair, the mechanical identities of normal and the harder 2 difficulties aren't 100% at odds, but they're so abrasive toward each other that I really think earning Witch Time through dodges should have been removed entirely in the standard difficulties. Save Witch Time for specific accessories and such instead. It's a solid mechanic, but not if it overpowers other mechanics that are more important to siphoning depth out of your gameplay. Because if you play Bayonetta the way normal wants you to play it, it's an incredibly shallow game, causing many of its other issues to shine through. And nobody should be forced to play through the poor man's remix of the game you actually want them to play, just to get to the deeper end of the pool. Don't forget, by the way, that we know a large portion of people never finish games, and an even larger amount that do finish games don't play through them more than once. So first impressions are important, and normal leaves a very poor impression of the game's mechanical depth, the thing that the biggest fans of Bayonetta really love, and the thing that the developers wanted you to dive into. You can't ask players to spend 15 hours playing their first time, and then say, it gets good after that. Nor can you blame the player if they choose to use the mechanics the way they see fit, and the game gives them the thumbs up despite it potentially hurting their experience in the long run if they choose to continue. There's obviously something to be said for letting normal stand on its own, as its own experience. I get it. But that doesn't apply when it's mandatory to progress to the real way the game itself is meant to be played. There's a reason developers emphasize the fact that if you let players strategize the fun out of your game, they will. And it's because a major part of game design is understanding that a large portion of your audience will want to take the shortest, easiest path to success, even if that utterly decimates the experience. So it's important to keep that in mind and design around it by making the shortest, easiest path to success one that highlights the depth and also gives them a genuinely fun, engaging time. That's why I always argue that outside of remix difficulties intended to change the experience or accessibility options intended to allow more people to play, every difficulty you offer should maintain the same mechanical identity as your quote-unquote best balanced difficulty. It's rare that every difficulty in a game gets the same amount of attention, let alone the attention it deserves. There's always a target difficulty, and it's nearly always normal. So if you're gonna force players to start on normal, and you know that even if you didn't, that's the difficulty most people would choose on their first and maybe only playthrough, you should make sure that difficulty puts your game's best foot forward. Players should want to use your mechanics because they find value in them that's core to the experience. You don't use the rally system in Bloodborne for funsies. You use it because no matter how hard or easy the game was for you, getting free health back for dealing damage is an incentive every player will want to take advantage of at all skill levels. Dodge offset, the variety in the combo system, accessories, and special moves, none of that translates the same way on normal while playing Bayonetta. I'd argue that's a pretty serious problem. The core issue here is that the game doesn't really do a good job of teaching any of the major mechanics on its own, and beyond that, it's so easy for the game to sabotage its attempts to teach you that it's only natural to miss almost everything from the very start. There are ancillary incentives to learn through the scoring system, but this often won't appeal to a learning player, and even then, if it doesn't impact the gameplay directly, many players won't be interested in it anyway. When was the last time you cared about getting a high score in Mario? Probably a long time ago, if ever. Many players primarily care about fun, hence why they're content with just mashing. There's nothing in the gameplay that drives one to want to learn, almost as if high-level play and low-level play are completely separate worlds, and as such, all of the potential depth is lost on them. Many players won't explore, scoring system or otherwise. With all that said, obviously that means I should like the game now, right? I just have to stick to hard or infinite climax and it all works for me, yeah? Well, no. When I said I don't think Bayonetta is a good game, I said it for a reason, and it's not just or even primarily because normal can ruin things for first-time players. If you keep playing and pushing yourself, that's a temporary problem for each individual player. Some players might not even experience it if they're okay with a game that's just about mashing. In regards to my larger problems with Bayonetta, I suppose it's best to start with a bit of cleanup discussion related specifically to the way normal works. Problems that don't really apply to hard or infinite climax, but also don't really affect the above issues much. Firstly, on normal, the vast majority of combat encounters, known as verses, are just recycled over and over. People often talk about the rather sizable enemy variety in Bayonetta, but they rarely put it in the context of normal difficulty itself. On normal, Bayonetta is kind of weird. It simultaneously spams many new enemy types constantly, while also spamming the same few enemy types and mobs constantly. Many missions in the first half of the game straight up introduce maybe 3 or more enemy types in just 4 or 5 encounters across the entire mission. And this goes well beyond the point where they're just trying to introduce enough enemies to have a bit of variety early on. What's more, rarely are monsters paired with others that aren't their kind or a variant of their kind, and even many examples with variants are repeated endlessly. You'll never find flaming and non-flaming enemies together, for example, or Grace and Glory with other enemies. You can fight Grace, Glory, both, or both in a gold form that prevents witch time called Gracious and Glorious, which we referenced earlier. On normal, you'll never find any other configurations of them, with other enemies. As such, there are many enemies that go practically unused beyond their introduction, with the game being content to just spam the same few basic angels, grand doggos, and scyther bros across the 15 hours or so normal takes if you're exploring. It's repetitive and not particularly diverse. Hard mode is a significant step up. Much tougher enemies immediately, they're much faster, and they do way more damage. But importantly, there's also more variety thrown at the player. It still usually likes to keep mobs to single enemy types and their variants, but it will mix it up at times, and verses will quite regularly spawn separate waves of completely different types of enemies back to back. The other remaining issue specific to normal deals with the ranking system. This ties into many of the other issues we'll discuss in a bit, but for now, let's lay down the bed for it all. Devil May Cry on normal difficulties generally understands that players will be new to the game. It therefore balances ranks on normal around playing on normal for your first time. As long as you're not struggling a ton more than expected, you'll primarily get between a C rank and an A rank on each mission. Not the worst, but not the best. In DMC, it's pretty hard to get lower than a C on normal. That means casual players aren't beaten into the ground by the fact that they're still learning. Instead, it's designed to make you feel like you're close enough to the highest ranks that, if you care at all about the ranking system, it's worth pushing yourself harder. However, to get better ranks, or get those same average ranks on higher difficulties, you'll have to learn to do better. This makes sense as an incentive for player growth. Give the player enough of a confidence boost to let them know that they're on the right track, and most players who are interested in the scoring system are likely to keep trying to push themselves to get better rankings. Simple. Bayonetta, by contrast, again due to many issues we'll get to soon, loves to dole out the worst award it has at the end of missions: Stone Awards. I don't really understand the psychological benefit this is supposed to have on the majority of players. Generally, telling them they're about as bad as they can get will just frustrate and confuse them, particularly if they felt they were doing pretty okay. And doubly so when, as we spoke about before, gameplay guidance is all over the place. How are they supposed to know which direction to go in to improve if the game isn't really guiding them and they continue to get Stone Awards? What exactly is lost by making it so that only on normal, learning players will generally get bronze, silver, or the occasional gold award on missions? If they want to move on to hard after that, push them as hard as you want on hard. Particularly because normal will still continue to push them much harder if they want to try for platinum or pure platinum awards there instead. This isn't really a get good situation, so much as just basic psychological incentive balance. It's important to remember, by the way, that new players are playing from a fresh file, meaning they start with no weapons, no moves, no accessories, no health, no magic, etc. So even beyond the fact that they're just starting to learn the game itself, they're underpowered compared to anyone doing a replay of the same mission on normal, making it harder for them from the outset. No way to parry, no way to dodge damage after technically getting hit, no grapple attack with the whip, a single hit will decimate their built-up magic because they don't have much, and also take upwards of a quarter of their health if it was a particularly brutal attack. Definitely a different experience from retrying after you beat it on normal. So it really should offer better awards given the circumstances of a fresh playthrough. Again, this would be different if they allowed you to play on hard or something from the start. The two core reasons a new player on normal probably won't get very high ranks is because a single death greatly affects your rank negatively, and because secret missions and optional encounters heavily count against you if you miss them. To get a good rank, you generally have to already know where all of the optional encounters are and do well on them, along with every other encounter. And dying from a single instant death QTE or whatever will instantly demote your rank by a whole level. Missions in Bayonetta are also extremely long compared to their peers, at least on a first playthrough. That doesn't sound bad until you realize it means trying for higher ranks requires a lot of retreading the boring parts of missions if you don't exploit exiting to the title screen, because one mistake can mean recompleting upwards of 20 minutes of a mission that the first time took you an hour, instead of DMC's usual 5 to 10 minutes on a replay. And that's further exacerbated when you realize that as long as you aren't needlessly taking tons of damage, falling off of ledges or whatever, the only parts of a mission that affect the rank you get are the actual encounters, meaning the rest is just wasted time on each attempt. Players can retry fights as many times as they want as long as they exit to the title screen after they make a mistake, but before finishing the fight. This is rather tedious considering the game is centered around retrying verses for higher ranks. You'd think since they didn't prevent players from exploiting the title menu option like this, they knew about it and expected it to be used. Therefore, you'd have hoped they would just include a load checkpoint option in the pause menu, but that's not the case. I can't imagine what it was like for PS3 players to get high ranks, since load times on that version were supposed to be horrible. The interesting thing about this is that a decent chunk of players could probably get bronze, silver, and gold awards on their first playthrough on normal, if the game didn't like to instantly kill and troll players so often, decimating an otherwise solid score. As I mentioned earlier, deaths count heavily against your rank. Even while skipping some optional verses, you could still get a bronze or silver, maybe a gold if you didn't die and did really well on every encounter, but that's easier said than done. Concrete information on the ranking system that includes proof seems to be incredibly difficult to find online, and there are many seemingly legitimate sources that are also highly conflicting with each other. The game illuminates nothing for you about the ranking system, and honestly even shares less info than Devil May Cry, thanks to its choice to obfuscate many facets of the system behind icons and medals rather than translating them into a universal score number. As I understand it, mission rankings are decided by simplifying each verse rank into a single-digit score, which you don't get to see, and which are themselves simplifications of the combo, damage, and time medals you got within each verse. Since I can't be sure of which explanation I found is the most accurate though, I won't be describing exactly how it works, because I and seemingly many other people don't know exactly how it works. That being said, there's still ultimately a few holes in each explanation I found, which nobody seems to have an answer for anyway. For example, I'm not sure how items affect your ranking exactly, since using most items will give you just a partial skull marker at the end of the mission. A full skull marker is the equivalent of a death, which lowers your mission ranking by a whole level. One explanation by the YouTube channel Yoshesuke, sorry if I butchered that, briefly mentions that a half skull marker seems to count against you in the same way as a full skull, but doesn't describe whether less than half a skull marker does the same, less, or nothing at all. Also, I'm not sure why a half skull marker would count the same if, when you continue to use items, that skull marker will continue to grow into a full one. Despite the needlessly opaque rules, this ranking system works well enough on its own. It's pretty obvious that getting better ranks on verses gets you a better score, and dying will hurt you even without knowing the specifics. The problems for a new player start with the fact that the game throws near constant traps at you. These traps are rarely engaging to work through or learn. Instead, they're just about memorizing the tricks the game plays, and memorizing where the game will and won't arbitrarily kill you for falling off a ledge. You then have to avoid the trap from that point forward. This sort of thing can be a constant nuisance if you're going for ranks, and it's extremely disheartening if you're just playing through normal on your first time. What types of traps are we talking about? Well, there are some better ones that work as a fun little pacing break set piece. One example would be this section where you find yourself falling out of the back of a plane with a large amount of shipping crates. Your goal is to jump between them to make it back onto the plane. While I have had the last button prompt refuse to show up a few times, leading to damage, this is still a mostly fair and enjoyable set piece. Or there's this one here, which sees you running down a path followed by a massive orb and occasionally being struck by lightning. Dodging the lightning at the right moment to enter witch time while rushing past the enemies is rewarding, doubly so with liberal use of the Panther transformation. But it also affords the player a little chance to show off, because the only way I can tell to get a high rank on this bit is to also somehow find the time to combo the hell out of the enemies along the way, without getting crushed by the orb. It's a cool way to ask players to channel the cocky, powerful heroine they're playing as. These set pieces and traps are well illustrated to the player, and are just forgiving enough that even the worst players should be able to barely make it out alive their first time. And if not, definitely the second. They also don't slow the pace down, and because of the clarity of their design, they don't require rote memorization to conquer on subsequent playthroughs. Even if you forget about these set pieces every single time you go through those missions, you should still do okay as long as you don't drop your controller or fall asleep. I cannot say the same for many of the other set pieces and traps. Firstly, Bayonetta loves its QuickTime events, both in combat and in cutscenes. Some of them are optional, most of them are not, and many of them will instantly kill you if you fail. Through all of this, by the way, remember that a death massively affects your rank, and there's no way to alter QuickTime events for people who don't enjoy them, or who struggle with them, whether due to lack of skill or disability. These QuickTime events are often extremely demanding, some of the most demanding I've ever experienced in a game. The timing ones sometimes only appear on screen for around a half a second before you fail, or fail you if you press the button too early. Meanwhile, some of the mashing ones are so strict that if you aren't already mashing as fast as possible by the time the QTE starts, you've already failed to max it out. In cases like torture attacks, messing these up or being unable to do them will lead to a significant decrease in the amount of damage they'll do, as well as combo points they offer. And some torture attacks are so brutal that I've only truly maxed them out 2 or 3 times over the dozens of attempts I've had. Same with a few of the climaxes. The volleyball one immediately comes to mind. In other cases, like countering Jean's Wicked Weaves, if you accidentally react to her counter QTE, you'll take damage if you don't do the button mashing sequence more or less perfectly. You can apparently dodge out of the way of the attack if you fail, but for me specifically, the only way I can have any chance of succeeding at the QTE itself is by positioning my hand in such a way that I won't be able to reach the dodge button in time. One might argue that you just shouldn't do them then if you're incapable of it, but that's not really a defense of the mechanic itself, because you're literally just asking players to completely ignore the mechanic and the damage dealing options, not to mention asking them to unlearn habits that decades of QTEs have built up in them, all because Bayonetta doesn't have a way to make them more lenient. That's like asking a player to constantly adjust the brightness on their television because the game they're playing regularly switches between areas that are way too bright and way too dark, but doesn't include an in-game brightness or gamma slider. Get better eyes, I guess. I don't think it's unfair to expect them to at least put an option in that auto-completes every QTE for accessibility, because let's be real, it's not like the QTEs are such an integral part of the beauty of the game's systems that it's just not the same without them. We're not talking about dodge offset or something, we're talking about a leftover gimmick from the mid-2000s that a fair amount of people can't even physically take part in, and most people actively despise. I would be surprised if anybody who defends the QTEs in this game would also defend them in other games. I've met people who defend this kind of stuff here, and then criticize it in things like David Cage games, even though David Cage games are openly about QTEs. After the 35-ish hours I've played Bayonetta so far, I'm getting extremely tired of having to stop every 30 seconds to perform QTEs. For me, it's a distraction at best, and an insufferable chore at worst. I would actually be fine with continuing to explore the mechanics going forward if I didn't have to deal with the QTEs. If they wanted to do it right, I'd say they should have offered QTE variation options. Maybe allow players to lengthen the time for reaction-oriented ones, lessen the amount of mashing required for mashing ones, change it so that you can hold the button instead of mash, or even offer alternative QTEs altogether. What if instead of mashing, you could turn it into a timed button combo instead? QTEs themselves aren't inherently bad, and I don't inherently hate them, but implementing them without any option to disable or alter them in a game where they're not really necessary, and implementing them poorly on top of that, is a problem. Again, in cutscenes and set pieces, the big issue is that the punishment for failing a QTE can often be instant death, immediately destroying your mission ranking. But what's worse is that they're not even consistent in their implementation. Like here, where I get blindsided by a tram, I expected a button prompt to dodge, because that's how the game had handled the set pieces up to that point, and I thought I was in a cutscene. Usually up to that point they give you button prompts for this sort of thing, but not here for some reason. It doesn't stop there, because prompts for the same type of action can also be completely different between set pieces. So the tram has no prompt for jumping over it. But earlier in Chapter 1, I got to one that showed the whole controller and required that I press up and X together. Later on, there's this one here while running from the lava that consists of a timed press of just the square button that has to be precise or you die. And yet another one for the aforementioned set piece where I'm jumping across the shipping crates, which asks me to just press the X button, no precision timing required. All of these are just jumping set pieces, and all of them are entirely different QTE types, except for the tram part, which makes you think it's a QTE, but it's actually organic gameplay. Some of these do damage, some of them instantly kill you, and all of them hurt your rank if failed. It's kind of a mess, and even now I can't often remember which ones will be which types of prompts. And no, the prompts don't change, they aren't randomized, they're just inconsistent. Even environmental hazards can be instant death, sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it'll kill you instantly, sometimes it'll respawn you, sometimes it'll just damage you and leave you to rush your way out before damage ticks again. And on top of this, the game loves to have enemies attack you right out of cutscenes. The first time this happens is at the start of Chapter 2, but I've never had this attack even get close to hitting me, so I just thought it was an anomaly. It then happens pretty regularly throughout the rest of the game, more or less any time a new enemy type is introduced. Take this example, where once the cutscene ends, I have around a third of a second to react to this attack. Or what about here, where after the cutscene ends, Bayonetta is already jumping down from the stairs back toward the enemies at the bottom, who are preparing attacks. Why blindside me like that? Either show me Bayonetta jumping down in the cutscene, or let me jump down myself, thank you very much. You could actually make this gimmick work. I'm not completely opposed to it, despite what it may seem. The problem is that I don't know when the cutscene is gonna end, so it's hard to prepare for a split-second dodge right afterward. So what ends up happening? I either don't bother and tank the damage, or I start mashing dodge near the end of the cutscene and render the gimmick such a non-issue that it might as well not even be there. A solution would have been to have the camera zoom out to reveal how far away the attack is from Bayonetta every time before it transitions to gameplay. You know how a ton of games these days do that whenever transitioning from a cutscene to gameplay? Do that. Reveal her and the attack from the gameplay camera right as you give me control, in one fluid camera movement. As it is now, the camera often just completely snaps to a new location, and a third of a second later, Bayonetta is laying on the ground having been hit by an attack. All of this compounds on itself to make an inconsistent mess of traps and tricks. It keeps you on your toes in a sense, but largely uses cheap tactics like seemingly random button prompts to do so, and yet at other times it's a trick that just leads to unfun habits like mashing dodge out of every cutscene involving an enemy. There's no real way I can find to tell what's gonna happen next without just memorizing it all, which means for the first playthrough I just have to tank it all. For me, almost none of it was engaging, interesting, or rewarding, and it ended up pissing me off because the abundance of these traps often turned what otherwise might have been a solid mission ranking on my first playthrough into a Stone Award. The issues don't really stop when you start getting into the aesthetics of the game either. At times, cutscene choreography and direction can be really solid. Much of the time, though, cutscenes are needlessly long, confusing, and clearly had severe budgetary limitations. And that's beyond the fact that the color cast on most scenes is really monotone. Now, I'm not one to criticize a game for simplicity that stems from a lack of money or the size of the team. I don't care that half the cutscenes are genuine slideshows. I get it, I totally do. They save their cutscene animation time and budget for the crazy moments and cool action set pieces. That's smart. My problem comes from the fact that instead of just letting the simplified cutscenes be, they felt the need to fill the screen with junk effects, chaotic cuts, and editing choices that are extremely distracting. For me, it was genuinely difficult to follow a multitude of scenes because I couldn't concentrate due to how often the important part of the image was obfuscated, moving, made really small, or whatever else. Sometimes within just a single 2-minute scene, we'll randomly jump from full animation to lightly animated stills, then there will be large gray film strips covering half the screen on the top and bottom, then small black ones on the side, but with black bars still cropping the top and bottom, then immediately after there will be black bars cropping the sides instead with smaller black film strips on the top and bottom that have tan squares in them. Then the whole screen is taken up by film strips that leave you with a thumbnail image of what's going on that constantly moves across the screen. It feels like they were trying to be intentionally chaotic and strange, like a Grasshopper Manufacturer game. But where something like Killer 7 is strange, its quirky decisions also serve a clear stylistic purpose. It's chaotic but never random. Bayonetta instead feels like they weren't confident they could keep anyone's attention unless they were using fully animated scenes, or constantly throwing generic After Effects style bullshit all over the place. There are even changes within the scenes themselves that feel arbitrary and confusing. This part, for example, sees Bayonetta and company suddenly going from a forest clearing to an airport. Later on, near the end, Luca takes Cereza to get her out of danger, but without any real warning, it's suddenly implied that he, crashes and blows up or something, but then he comes back later just fine. I think the intention was to show surprise at his reappearance, but it would have been a surprise anyway, considering he was supposed to be long gone. His perceived death didn't add any value, really, because Bayonetta's reaction to it was minimal anyway. That's not to imply the story makes a ton of sense without these problems anyway. It might, but I couldn't glean much but the absolute basics from it. As far as I could find, Bayonetta has no real, stated motivation across the entire adventure until the end. Her motivations stop at, she lost her memories, and she likes killing angels. And while that could be enough, she's never given any direction for these motivations, so it feels like she's just wandering around and happens to end up in a situation where both motivations are fulfilled. Nobody that I can remember says something like, if you want to learn more about your past and you want to kill angels along the way, head here. It's like she's just on a leisurely stroll for most of the game. It was hours in, past Chapter 5, before I really got any semblance of an actual story happening. And even then, it's only the last third of the game that starts to bring everything together. Ultimately, I still didn't really understand the reason most events happened by the end, so much as I just understood the events themselves, kind of. So, Bayonetta is actually a woman named Cereza, but there's also the current young Cereza who thinks Bayonetta's her mother and is also Bayonetta. I don't understand why she calls her mummy, nor why she's even there. Other people can see and interact with her, so it's like, time travel? Did magic will young Cereza into existence in the current time period? I don't remember the game ever adequately explaining this, and that's despite slogging through the endlessly repetitive notes the game leaves all over the place for your perusal. Like, after the game has ended, I get it, but it doesn't explain how or why anything happened the way it did, and as such feels way undercooked. This is likely a narrative/writing problem, not an actual issue with the plot itself. It probably makes sense, but it was ultimately terribly communicated. At least the music is good, as is the acting and sound design. I'd say more on that, but it's pretty self-evident if you play the game for yourself. Besides, this video is already going long, so I think I should get to the last section of issues that, for me, ultimately killed the majority of any enjoyment I might have been able to find in Bayonetta. Oh yes, that's right, I still could have enjoyed the game a lot more than I did with all of the above issues intact. There are a lot of small things that added up for me personally that I didn't really like about the game. For example, I personally felt Bayonetta was far too floaty for combat, and I didn't enjoy how that translated to aerial combat in particular. I also wasn't a fan of the major motorcycle section, which ended up just being minutes upon minutes of holding down square and occasionally pressing the dodge button. Not to mention, the last set piece where the highway falls apart is also kind of a mess. I didn't like the insane length of the Space Harrier section either, the fact that the missile you're riding always seems to be in the way of things I want to see, and that the dodge sickeningly spins the entire screen. Anyone with motion sickness problems probably has a nightmarish time with that part, and that's to say nothing about the fact that you have to do this part anytime you want to replay the best boss fight against Jean. I didn't like that I wasn't allowed to change any of my controls, the fact that the game doesn't tell you about the quick cutscene skip you unlock after you beat the game, the fact that vertical aiming controls on the turrets and in the Space Harrier section are hidden in their control guides instead of the control options themselves. I don't like that you can't enter practice mode from the menu or change weapons while you're in it, forcing you to rely on entering and exiting loading screens to utilize it to any real degree. You can alternatively just practice in an empty part of a mission, but then you don't get the combo guide on screen and have to repeatedly enter and exit the menu to see your combos. I went the whole game not really understanding the main purpose behind the magic meter outside of torture attacks, only to then learn there isn't really one beyond some of your special attacks taking small amounts of it and some accessories utilizing it. It's also slightly bothersome that I have to find and finish every Alfheim Portal secret mission to unlock the game's Bloody Palace equivalent. Bloody Palace can be a really important way to practice without the pomp and circumstance that comes with missions themselves, though locking it behind the secret missions is still better than, say, locking it behind beating the hardest difficulty or something like that, as I was originally told was the case. There also isn't a ton of real exploration, and many of the puzzles, if you can call them that, are just sort of busy work, where you will do such riveting tasks as go to a thing, hit it, then go interact with another thing, all of it shown to you clearly in cutscenes. Every level is really linear, which is fine, but when there's almost nothing to do in them other than smash benches and pots to find concoction materials, it can become painfully obvious how inorganic mission structure is. It effectively doesn't get much more complex than go to location, smashing pots along the way, watch cutscene, do verse, repeat. And when you combine that with the aforementioned fact that the game adores spamming the same small handful of enemies in most encounters, while also spamming single encounters with brand new enemies and little to no interweaving of either, it starts to feel like a chore. I'm not exploring an ancient religious city that has mysterious modern technology. I'm treading and retreading the same few locations in a linear fashion with no character motivations contextualizing my travels, and no organic aesthetic presentation or combat presentation to make the battles in between feel like anything more than arcade challenges. That's kind of fine, but if you're gonna do that, let me skip all the stuff in between on repeats when I'm just trying to get a better rank. Real bosses are almost non-existent for most of the game, unless you count the few fights with Jeanne that, on normal and outside of the final fight with her, were so easy, they seemed more like story set pieces than actual fights. And to this day, I still have no idea what I'm supposed to do against the first boss, making it one of the most consistently frustrating and long-winded. But then many of the later bosses are so easy that I rarely even got hit on normal unless I was slacking off, like the tentacle babyface guy or the shark. No, I'm not gonna look up their real names. That's not to say the bosses are all bad or anything. Most are solid, and a few, like Jeanne's final incarnation, are pretty sweet. It's just that sometimes they can have really poor conveyance or puzzling difficulty pacing. They also often have instant kill sections that, if you fall into them, can be super frustrating. The final boss has 2 instant kills, and one of them is a set piece that I thought was telling me to smash the boss into every planet along the way to the sun, because that sounds ridiculously Bayonetta to me. Nope, hit a single planet and that's a death, ranking incinerated. Many of the optional verses and secret missions are also hidden in incredibly dumb ways. A fair amount of the secret missions only show up after you've crossed an arbitrary threshold in that mission, which then requires you to backtrack basically as far as the level will allow you to in order to find the entrance. Some missions have 3 or 4 secret missions, leading you to have to do a verse or cross an invisible line, then backtrack a ways, do the secret mission, go back to where you were and head forward through the next verse, then backtrack again, do the next secret mission, then go back and continue forward again, do the next verse, then backtrack again. It's just, why? Especially because the game is totally capable of some great secret mission locations. There's my favorite one, which requires you to head into this area and notice that the fan blades can be passed through when in Witch Time. You then have to court enemies past each fan blade to reach the mission location. It's genuinely fantastic and probably my favorite secret mission location in any hack and slash. I don't know what you're supposed to do to get to it in Infinite Climax, though. Secret missions themselves are also generally pretty decent, and they scale with each difficulty, which provides the player options for completing them at different skill levels to earn the initial rewards, and makes the fact that you have to complete them to plat or pure plat a mission less tedious. It's a true shame that you can't pick them from the menu after you found them though, so that if you're just struggling to beat one for the upgrade item, you don't have to redo the whole mission and find the portal again. Anyway, there are also some attacks that don't offer witch time when properly dodged, which is yet another example of having to arbitrarily memorize something that has no logical or consistent explanation. I don't mind that some attacks don't offer witch time, and enemies like Gracious and Glorious that don't allow traditional witch time also make sense, but considering every enemy type in the game except Jean is an angel, I don't think it's too much to ask that they unify the tell for attacks that don't offer witch time. Make all of these attacks the same color or something. Through a lot of my first playthrough, I genuinely just thought I wasn't dodging precisely enough, and that's why I wasn't getting witch time. All of these sorts of issues, compounded with everything we've already discussed, to create an experience that would feel rather janky on its own, and they hold up even worse when you consider the modern ports and the fact that they could have rectified some of these issues if Armature had been given the chance to do so. That definitely should have been the case at least with things like control remapping, or the ease of using and accessing practice mode. Still, there are two more problems that ultimately broke the camel's back for me. The things that ruined my first experience with the game, and even now, after dozens of hours, a multitude of playthroughs, beating hard and infinite climax, as well as getting the platinum trophy, still plague my experience to the point of immense frustration. These problems are the camera and the auto-lock system. I cannot stress enough just how frustratingly annoying I found both of these systems, with the core problem simply being that the automatic camera movement and the auto lock-on system can't be disabled. If they could, they'd still be pretty poorly implemented, but it would be a problem that could be solved. Unfortunately, they can't. So firstly, there's one important note that needs to be kept in mind. Similar to DMC and the like, enemies generally won't attack Bayonetta if they're off-screen. Instead, their AI prioritizes getting on-screen, which then gives them permission to attack. Or, well, most enemies won't attack you when they're off-screen. This is not true for every enemy in Bayonetta, with those that have ranged attacks that include clear sound cues being allowed to attack at nearly any time. This is mostly okay, though the sound cue doesn't tell you where off-screen they are, and therefore how far away the attack is, but that's not too big of a deal. Particularly if, like me, after your first playthrough, you turn off the music so you can concentrate on those sound cues. The problems start when you realize the camera often likes to readjust itself the second you start attacking an enemy, taking control of this AI system out of your hand. The auto camera doesn't seem to be aware of the location of other enemies at all, meaning it can often end up with enemies obscuring your view. Sometimes enemies will go translucent when in front of the camera, but not always, and often the camera will dive too low or go too high for your liking. It also likes to readjust too often when changing targets regularly. You have no choice in this matter other than to either deal with it or fight it whenever it happens, taking your thumb off of all of the main attack buttons. That also completely prevents the use of dodge offset while moving the camera, because again, you can't remap the controls even in the modern ports. This issue with the camera taking control and doing a poor job doesn't always play nice with the aforementioned AI patterns. You see, even if a single sliver of an enemy makes its way on screen for a single frame, and they start an attack, they can continue that attack. In DMC, they seem to have a slight delay most of the time before they're allowed to attack. So while you're busy fighting with the camera's attempts to move wherever it wants in Bayonetta, literal fractions of enemy bodies are just barely making their way on screen with you not noticing it, and then they're allowed to hit you with attacks you could have never seen coming. On top of that, it isn't even consistent, and sometimes enemies will attack you from off-screen when they're not supposed to, as seen in these examples. This is all on top of the frantic readjustment the camera makes anytime you change Bayonetta's direction in a tight space. These readjustments can be so quick that it's almost instant, the shift sometimes being so severe that your mind blanks for a second because you no longer know where you are in relation to everything else. The entire image changed. But at the same time, the camera is still a solid object, so it can get stuck up against the wall itself, disallowing you from seeing anything. This is the reason early DMC games, for as many problems as the camera could have, primarily used fixed camera angles, and why later games like Devil May Cry 5, which pretty much always allow you control of the camera, don't try to constantly wrench control of the camera away from you. Camera problems crop up constantly, and the rotation of the camera changes your analog stick controls, since they're camera relative. This makes things like use of the Moon of Mahakala needlessly difficult at points because you have to push the stick toward the enemy to block their attacks, which means the correct direction is changing along with the camera. The perfect example of this is the torture attack tutorial fight in the prologue, which has a camera that constantly rotates, often sinks really low or goes really high, and enemies and objects are near constantly in your way. On Hard and Infinite Climax, this was one of the hardest sections for me, in no small part because use of the Moon of Mahakala was all but impossible here. Meanwhile, the first flashback fight with Jean loves to have problems with the corners of the tight room, particularly because on normal you'll be jumping across all of the walls along the way. This fight is the tutorial for that. And the camera itself flat out refuses to track Jean much of the time, forcing you to do it yourself. This sort of problem can be easy for some people to ignore. Some might not even notice just how often things they need to know are hidden off screen, or how often the camera yanks control away. But similar to when I discussed camera issues in Donkey Kong Country last year, issues that nobody else brings up, that doesn't mean it isn't still a problem, and the camera here can be a serious problem. But the pain is only exacerbated when you include the auto-lock system. Auto lock-on is generally a mechanic that is looked down upon in games like this, and generally it's for good reason, because managing large groups of enemies can often be made extremely difficult when auto lock is deciding who you can target. People despised its inclusion in DMC Devil May Cry, for example, which is why they changed it in the definitive edition. Auto-lock in Bayonetta got me hit so many times because it would act up when I was trying to target a specific enemy. It also has a tendency to move the camera around whenever it starts targeting a new enemy that is more than 90-ish degrees away from your last target. So if it switches back and forth because you're pressing in different directions to perform special moves or adjust Bayonetta's location, the camera has a fit. It also has a tendency to refuse to switch targets sometimes, even when you clearly want it to. The kicker is that it's not really necessary to have this feature in the game in the first place, let alone make it mandatory. Most hack and slash games prove this easily. Allowing the player to freely direct attacks until they hold the lock-on button is the norm in these games, because it works. But even the manual lock-on is awkward in Bayonetta because it still works like it does in DMC games, forcing your character into a walking state. Again, that would make sense if I was free to target whatever I wanted when I'm not locked on. It would serve as a way to ensure precision, but that's not the case here. Literally all I'm asking with both of these systems is the option to disable them. It would infinitely improve my experience with the game, but alas, that's impossible. This secret mission is a good example of how this stuff can be a problem. In it, you're expected to protect your body from attack while defeating all of the enemies in a soul form. You can only hurt enemies while you're out of body like this. The enemies will target you, but they'll also target your body. It can be incredibly difficult to keep track of everything that's going on when you can't keep the camera tracked on your body because it's constantly moving, when the enemies can hit your body while it's off screen, and when the autolock insists on attacking some other enemy while you're trying to stop one of them from hitting your body. It's one of the only secret missions that I didn't like despite enjoying the concept, and it's entirely because of how these systems work. The big issue with these two shortcomings, and the QTEs as well, is that these affect every playthrough. I can memorize all of the tricks and traps. I can choose to only play on hard and infinite climax on my existing file to avoid normal's enemy pacing and other issues. I know how the mechanics work, so I won't be misled anymore, but I can't avoid the obsession with QTEs, the auto lock, or the camera problems. Short of buying it on PC and then hopefully finding a mod, the game is stuck this way no matter how I try to change it, and that's truly sad for me. It really is, because I do see a game that I could have loved buried deep inside. The combination of all of the above problems, big and small, are what killed my experience with Bayonetta. I didn't hate every moment. Some parts were kinda boring, and some were a bit tedious or frustrating, but there are definitely flashes of brilliance hidden within. Unfortunately, with everything that got in my way, I still ended up genuinely hating a fair amount of the experience overall. Again, I want to stress that basically none of my ire is directed toward the core mechanics of the combat. Once you get past the preconceptions it lays you with, and once you learn its goals, you realize an enormous amount of effort went into maximizing the game's depth while keeping the core combat rather unique. Before I close this video out, I figured I'd share a few stats that I found interesting while browsing the PlayStation trophies on my way to the Platinum. While these numbers obviously only tell a slice of the whole story, they can still indicate towards certain patterns. They're not some bulletproof justification for my critique or my mindset here, but I think they're an interesting little look into how people play this game. So firstly, just 5.6% of people beat all chapters on hard on PS4. That means just over 1 out of every 20 people continued to play past normal and actually finished the next difficulty, if they played on normal in the first place, instead of easy or very easy. That is also only 1.5% more than the amount of people who beat Infinite Climax, and 2.1% more than the people that got the Platinum, which means most everyone who beat Hard also went all the way. However, how many of these people were already a fan and had played previous versions of the game? Meanwhile, just 22.2% of people beat it on normal, meaning only about 1/5 made it all the way through. Another 7.4% beat it on any difficulty, meaning that percentage actually beat easy auto or very easy auto instead of normal. If you want some indication of how the QTEs and set pieces can be unclear for some, only 56% of people dodged the tram in Chapter 2 that I talked about, and that includes everyone like myself who missed it the first time and went back later to get it. Again, I believe that's likely because people expected a button prompt and thought they were in a cutscene, like myself. The inconsistency of it got us, not the actual set piece. Most of the critical reviews and discussions I see on Bayonetta certainly try to be fair and unbiased, but they also tend to outright ignore a lot of the issues they'll openly heavily criticize in other games. On top of this, even when there's legitimate, valuable critique going on, it's not uncommon for people to spend time explaining a system's basic function and then default to saying it's badass, or flashy, or really cool, as if explaining why the system is good is unnecessary. But you can't just assume, intentionally or otherwise, that a mechanic's value within its larger systems is self-evident. It's fine if your aesthetic for those systems is great, but if we're discussing the mechanics and the design, you have to generally offer something actually design-oriented to explain why it's useful to the player. It being badass isn't that, because if a player happens to not find it cool or interesting or badass, they should still be able to understand why that mechanic has gameplay value. I know if this video gets any real attention, I'm gonna get a lot of "get good, scrub," "I didn't experience any of that, so it must not be true," and "high level play this and high level play that" style comments. Because the vast majority of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, and if that's the case, maybe think of subscribing if you like this video, because it helps the channel out immensely. These viewers won't know that I do crave a fair challenge in many games I play. I like highly challenging games. They won't understand that this isn't about blaming my own deficiencies or hatred of challenge on the game. I think games like Devil May Cry get more enjoyable once they start pushing you, and I often argue they're too easy to properly teach players most of the time on their standard difficulties. But I don't like Bayonetta. For me, I'd argue it's a good idea with relatively awful execution in many crucial spaces. If you can look past its problems, I'm genuinely happy for you. I really wish I could too. For what it's worth, I wouldn't be opposed to giving Bayonetta 2 a try as well someday, if it ever comes to something that isn't a Nintendo console, and it won't. But what do you guys think? Have you played Bayonetta? When was the last time you tried it? Did you enjoy it? And if you haven't played it, do you think these problems would bother you much? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.